Did you know that a single bowl of fat could determine whether an entire family would survive the polar winter or perish from the cold? The northern wilderness did not forgive mistakes, and darkness in the Viking Age was not just an absence of light, but a tangible, formidable enemy. The Scandinavians lived in a world where the sun could not rise above the horizon for weeks, turning day into eternal twilight. In these conditions, fire became more than just a tool for cooking or heating. It was the sacred center of life, the only protection from the piercing wind and maddening darkness. To survive this period, Northerners developed unique technologies that allowed them to conserve heat and light with minimal resources. Their engineering minds worked not only on the creation of warships, but also on improving everyday life in extreme conditions. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how a piece of ordinary moss and fish oil were turned into an engineering marvel that burned continuously for 3 days. What if I told you that the Vikings' main enemy was not a warrior with an axe, but the endless polar night? The psychological pressure of darkness during the winter months was an enormous test for the human mind. People found themselves locked in their homes, cut off from the outside world by snowdrifts and icy winds. In such conditions, sanity depended directly on the availability of a constant source of light. Ordinary fires burned out too quickly, requiring huge amounts of wood, which was in short supply. The Vikings needed an invention that could burn for hours without requiring constant attention and large amounts of fuel.
So the darkness grew colder, pressing in on all sides. We huddled close, waiting for a dawn that seemed would never come.
The solution was an oil lamp, simple in form but ingenious in content and efficiency. It was not just a lamp, but a symbol of the victory of human ingenuity over the forces of nature. The bowls were carved from steatite, a stone that was easy to work with and retained heat well. The shape of the bowl was designed so that the oil flowed evenly to the wick, without flooding it and extinguishing the flame. The steatite was heated by the flame, liquefying the fat that had solidified in the cold and sustaining the combustion process. The main secret of this technology was the wick, which was made not from fabric, but from a special type of moss or fluff. Plant fibers were collected in the summer, dried, and woven into dense bundles capable of smoldering for a long time. Such a wick did not burn instantly, as dry grass or wood chips would. It worked like a pump, slowly drawing fuel to the flame and providing an even, dim light. This light was far from the brightness of modern electricity, but in complete darkness it seemed dazzling. Such a lamp could burn for several days at a time on a single filling, which was critical during storms. Women monitored the oil level, adding more as needed, but the lamp did not require constant attention. This freed up their hands for work, allowing them to engage in crafts even in the darkest hours. The lamp's flame was quiet, without crackling or sparks, creating an atmosphere of calm and reliability. Life gathered around this tiny flame. Stories were told, and future trips were planned.
Winds favor the westward route this season. We should make landfall before the moon turns.
Aye, but the northern currents are swift. We must be prepared.
True.
The light from such a lamp was also used to heat small rooms or sleeping areas. The heat emitted by burning fat and heated stones was enough to slightly raise the air temperature nearby. This was an example of incredible resource conservation, with one device performing several functions at once. The Vikings knew how to get the most out of the simplest things that surrounded them in their daily lives. Each such lamp was a small center of civilization in the middle of an icy desert. Interestingly, these lamps were portable and could be taken to farm buildings. This made it possible to check food supplies, maintain equipment, or simply move between buildings. However, the open flame was instantly extinguished by the wind, so there were tricks for using them outdoors. The lamps were placed in boxes made of translucent cowhide or mica to protect the fire. Such lanterns gave off a dim light, but provided enough guidance to prevent people from getting lost in their own yard. The technology for making these lamps was passed down from generation to generation as precious knowledge. Craftsmen who knew how to find the right stone and carve the perfect shape were held in high esteem. Every crack or chip in the bowl could lead to the loss of precious fuel, so the quality of the work was a matter of life and death. Archaeologists find these stone relics of the era throughout Scandinavia and beyond. They silently tell us how people fought the darkness 1,000 years ago.
Look at this groove here.
Yes, that's where the wick would sit. It's exquisite craftsmanship.
This dim light was a beacon of hope, a reminder that the sun would surely return. It allowed people to see the faces of their loved ones, which was a crucial factor in psychological support. In a world full of shadows and uncertainty, the oil lamp was an anchor of reality. It outlined a circle of safety, beyond which it was not worth venturing unnecessarily. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how something as simple as moss and stone could save people's sanity? Write about it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new dives into history. Are you ready to learn the truth about where the fuel that burned for days came from? Wood in Scandinavia, especially in the northern regions and on islands such as Iceland, was a precious resource. Burning good wood for light was an unaffordable luxury bordering on madness. So the Vikings turned their attention to the sea, which provided them not only with food, but also with energy. The main source of fuel for lamps was the fat of marine mammals and fish. Obtaining this resource was hard and dangerous work that required collective effort. Hunting seals or whales provided the settlement with supplies for the entire long winter. Seal fat, or blubber, had unique properties. It did not solidify completely even at low temperatures. This made it an ideal fuel for use in the cold rooms of longhouses. In addition, it burned cleanly and for a long time, producing an even flame. The process of harvesting fat began immediately after a successful hunt, right on the shore. The carcasses were cut up, separating the thick layer of subcutaneous fat from the meat and skin. This fat was cut into pieces and melted in large cauldrons over a low heat. It was important not to overheat the mass so that it would not burn and spoil. The resulting transparent liquid was poured into barrels or leather wineskins for storage. The smell during melting was specific, permeating people's clothes and hair. However, for people of that era, this smell was associated not with stench, but with safety and warmth. The presence of full barrels of seal oil meant that the house would be bright and relatively warm. Poor families who did not have access to seal fat used cod liver oil or other fish oils. Fish oil burned less efficiently, produced more soot and an unpleasant smell, but still provided light. Seal blubber was so valuable that it was often used as currency in trade and tax payments. The wealth of a farmstead was often measured not in gold, but in stocks of dried fish and barrels of fat. It was the liquid energy of the Viking Age, the equivalent of modern oil. Control over seal rookeries or whale stranding sites could cause serious conflicts. Fuel economy was part of everyday culture and child rearing. Lamps were lit only when it was really necessary for work. Burning precious fat just for the sake of it was considered a sign of stupidity and wastefulness. The elders taught the young how to trim the wick properly so that it would not smoke or consume too much fuel.
Only enough wick to catch the oil. Remember, boy, wastefulness means darkness. Be mindful of the flame.
The quality of the fat directly affected the quality of life in the home during the winter. Well-purified fat produced a bright flame and polluted the air in the room less. Poorly rendered fat smoked causing people to cough and their eyes to water. Therefore, the process of preparing fuel was entrusted only to experienced people. Sometimes aromatic herbs such as juniper were added to the fat to mask the pungent smell. It was a kind of attempt to create comfort even in such harsh conditions. But in most cases, functionality was prioritized over comfort. The main task was to survive the winter, not to enjoy the aromas. Fat reserves were stored in cool outbuildings to prevent the product from going rancid. Spoiled fat burned poorly and emitted an unbearable stench that was impossible to get rid of. The loss of reserves due to improper storage could be a tragedy for the whole family. Now that we know how homes were lit, the question arises, how did they keep warm? In the next chapter, you will learn how architecture helped people survive in freezing temperatures when it was -40 outside. What if I told you that Viking houses were like upside-down ships embedded in the ground? A longhouse is not just a dwelling. It is a unique engineering system designed to retain heat. The main enemy inside the room was drafts, which could cool the house down in a matter of minutes. Therefore, the construction of the walls and roof was thought out to the smallest detail to create a thermos effect. The walls were often made not straight, but slightly curved outward, which increased their resistance to wind loads. The main material used for insulation was not only scarce wood, but also turf. Thick blocks of peat and earth were laid along the outer walls, creating a powerful insulating layer. Such a living wall could reach a meter in thickness, reliably cutting off the interior space from the cold. In summer, the grass on the roof and walls turned green, and in winter it was covered with snow, which served as additional insulation. Inside such a house, the temperature was always significantly higher than outside, even without a strong fire. In the center of the house was a long, open hearth, which was the heart of the entire heating system. The smoke escaped through a special opening in the roof, but the design was such that the warm air was retained inside. The room was filled with layers of warm air, which rose under the high roof and slowly cooled. People slept on raised platforms along the walls, where the temperature was most comfortable. The absence of large windows was a conscious decision, not a technical limitation. Any opening in the wall was a potential bridge for cold air to escape, taking precious heat with it. Light entered only through the smoke hole, and a few tiny openings covered with a translucent membrane. Dim lighting was the price to pay for not freezing to death in one's sleep. The floors in longhouses were often earthen, packed down to the hardness of stone. Sometimes they were covered with a layer of straw or reeds for additional insulation from the cold ground. Wealthy homes might use wooden flooring, which created an air gap. Walking on such a floor was warmer, and your feet froze less. The interior of the house had no solid partitions, which allowed warm air to circulate freely. Areas were separated by curtains made of heavy woolen fabric or animal skins. This allowed for privacy when necessary without disrupting the overall thermal envelope. All living heat, including the heat of human bodies and sometimes animals, remained inside. The entrance often had a vestibule to prevent cold air from entering the living area directly. Doors were made low and thresholds high, forcing those entering to bow and step over them. This simple solution blocked the cold air that crept along the ground. Every element of the architecture served a single purpose: to conserve energy. In winter, young livestock were often housed in the longhouse, separated by a light partition. The animals served as additional living batteries, warming the air with their breath and bodies. The specific smell did not bother anyone when life was at stake. Living alongside animals was the norm for survival. The roof rested on strong pillars inside the house, which were often decorated with carvings. This structure was independent of the walls, which made it possible to replace rotten turf without dismantling the entire house. The reliability of the roof was a guarantee of safety, as the weight of wet snow could be enormous. In such a house, a person felt protected from the hostile outside world. Thick walls dampened the howling wind, creating an illusion of silence and peace. Like this post, if you are impressed by the sophistication of ancient Scandinavian housing. Ready to learn a secret that will change your perception of the resources of the past? We are used to thinking of Vikings against the backdrop of dense forests, but the reality of many settlements was different. In Iceland, Greenland, and the Northern Islands, trees were catastrophically scarce, and those that did grow were dwarf trees. It was impossible to build houses and burn fires from local wood, so people depended on the gifts of the sea. Driftwood, wood dried by the sea and washed ashore, was valued as much as silver. Currents brought tree trunks from distant Siberia and North America to the shores of Scandinavia. This wood, saturated with salt and dried by the wind, burned with a bright, unusual flame. Each log had its owner. The right to collect driftwood was strictly regulated by law. Stealing a piece of wood from someone else's shore was punished as severely as stealing livestock. However, driftwood was not enough for all needs, and it was saved for building and repairing ships. For everyday heating, the Vikings used what was under their feet: peat. Harvesting peat was hard summer work. It was cut into briquettes and dried in the sun. Burning peat produced little flame, but a lot of heat and acrid, distinctive smoke. Another common, though not the most pleasant fuel, was dung, dried animal manure. It was collected in pens, formed into patties, and carefully dried throughout the summer. Dung smoldered long and evenly, providing a stable temperature in the hearth. The smell was unpleasant, but people quickly got used to it. In treeless areas, they even used animal bones, which were first boiled to extract the fat. The bones, saturated with fat residue, burned hot, although they required a high temperature to ignite. This was the fuel of desperation when all other supplies were running low. The Vikings did not throw away anything that could provide even a drop of heat. The ability to build a fire from damp or poor quality materials was a vital skill. Fire was cherished like the apple of one's eye, and every effort was made to ensure that it never went out completely. At night, the coals were covered with ash so that they could be rekindled in the morning, saving energy and tinder. Losing the fire in winter could spell doom for the entire household. The hearth was designed to burn any available fuel as efficiently as possible. The stones around the fire pit accumulated heat and gave it off long after the fire had burned out. This allowed precious resources to be saved at night. An engineering approach was evident even in the laying of the stones. Gathering fuel was a never-ending concern for all family members, from children to the elderly. Every fine day in summer was used to find and dry something combustible. Winter was unforgiving, and an empty woodshed meant death. Preparing for the cold took up most of the warm season. The paradox was that, living in a harsh climate, the Vikings often suffered from a shortage of fuel. They had to show remarkable ingenuity to keep their hearths burning. This constant struggle for warmth tempered their character and taught them to appreciate the little things. But if the fire was burning, what did people do on long winter evenings? In the next chapter, you will learn how winter isolation turned into a period of incredible productivity. Winter for the Viking was not a time of hibernation or idleness, as it may seem to modern man. On the contrary, it was a period of intense labor, transferred from the fields and the sea to the roof of the longhouse, where it was possible to work by the light of the fire. It was during these dark months that the masterpieces of craftsmanship we admire today were created, because the cold outside made it impossible to do anything. Limited space and time forced people to focus on the small things and not miss a single detail. The winter season turned the house into a workshop where every day was filled with work. Such activity helped people retain the skills they had acquired in the summer. When the sea was covered with ice, their hands reached for tools to continue creating. Winter became a time to accumulate resources that would then be used throughout the year. For many residents, this was the most productive period because nothing distracted them from their work. Therefore, long houses became centers of craft life. Men repaired and made weapons, tools, and agricultural implements. In the light of oil lamps, the blades of axes and spearheads gleamed, sharpened and polished for hours so that they would not fail on expeditions. This was a time for carving wood and bone, creating intricate patterns and decorations that required patience. Every spoon and every comb became a work of art, filled with meaning and symbolism. The men knew that the safety of their families depended on the quality of their work. Working with wood and metal developed precision of movement and attention to form. Many items became family heirlooms, passed down to children and grandchildren. Even simple tools were made to be beautiful, because beauty was considered part of strength. The Vikings believed that patterned objects provided protection, so they decorated them willingly. Every winter night brought new creations. Women, whose hands never knew rest, were busy processing wool and flax. The sound of the loom was the rhythm of winter life, continuing from morning to night, and it created a sense of movement even when silence reigned outside the walls. Making sails for ships required thousands of hours of painstaking work and kilometers of thread that had to be spun by hand. Winter was the only time when it was possible to weave the huge pieces of cloth needed for summer voyages. Therefore, women bore a huge responsibility for future journeys. Their craftsmanship was the foundation of the Vikings' naval power. The sails had to be strong enough to withstand storms and light enough to provide speed. Weaving required mathematical precision because any mistake could weaken the fabric. Women preserved the traditions of their ancestors by passing on their methods to their daughters. Their work reflected the history of the peoples of the North. At this time, they also sewed and repaired clothes for the whole family, preparing for the coming seasons. Bone or metal needles flashed in the dim light, sewing leather and fabric to protect people from the wind and snow. Embroidery and trimmings on clothing served not only for beauty, but also as talismans that protected travelers. Every item created in winter carried the warmth of the craftsman's hands and the hope of spring. Wool, fur, and linen were transformed into reliable protection from the cold. Viking clothing was not only practical, but also symbolic. Its patterns told of family, status, and personal achievements. Women worked with materials that had been dried and prepared in advance during the summer. Craftswomen knew that poor clothing could cost lives, especially on long journeys. Therefore, they used the winter to create the best items. Metallurgists and blacksmiths continued their work in special outbuildings or separate smithies. The winter cold allowed them to better control the hardening temperature of blades and tools, making them strong and reliable. The sound of the hammer on the anvil echoed across the snow-covered surroundings, announcing that life goes on despite the frost. Working with fire and metal warmed not only the body but also the spirit. The smithy was the center of power in the community. A good blacksmith was worth his weight in gold because he knew how to create things that saved lives in battle and in everyday life. He repaired crowbars, chain links, knives, and arrowheads. He He knew the properties of different types of ore and coal and chose the right time to cool the metal. A true master could determine the temperature by the color of the red-hot iron. His work was indispensable in winter. Children learned the craft by watching adults and helping them with simple tasks. It was a school of life where knowledge was passed on through practice and joint work, not through books. Boys learned to tie knots and cut wood. Girls learned to spin and cook, because these skills were essential for survival. These skills were absorbed with their mother's milk and reinforced every winter evening. Children quickly became part of the communal work. Winter gave them time to ask questions and try their hand at things. They were proud of every little success, and adults encouraged their efforts. Through such activities, children understood the value of work and the importance of responsibility. The elders always made sure that the child did the work correctly, but did not interfere with his independence. This is how future masters were formed. Repairing ships and boats that had been pulled ashore was also an important part of winter work. Replacing planks, caulking seams, and tarring the hull required attention and time to ensure that the vessel did not leak. The ship had to be ready to be launched as soon as the ice melted and it was possible to go to sea. The safety of the crew and the success of future voyages depended on the quality of the winter repairs. The craftsmen took this task very seriously. The ship was considered the soul of the community because trade and glory depended on it. In winter, it was cleaned, reinforced, and every crack was repaired. The men discussed new routes while standing near the raised hull. The sails were checked no less than the boards, because every element had to be reliable. Thus, winter turned into a season of maritime preparation. All this work was preparation for going out into the outside world. But how did they find their way in this world when it was dark, even during the day? We will talk about this in the next chapter.
These are the paths of our fathers. We must follow them through the dark months. The ice to the east is treacherous, but it is the fastest way.
Steady as she goes. Keep her headed northeast by the stone.
Hey, Captain.
What if I told you that the Vikings could find the sun even when it was not visible? Winter sailing was rare and dangerous, but sometimes necessary. In conditions of polar night or constant thick cloud cover, the usual landmarks became useless. The stars were hidden behind the clouds, and the sun barely rose above the horizon, giving only a diffuse grey light. Legends tell of a mysterious sunstone that helped captains see through the clouds. Modern research confirms that Iceland spar, calcite crystals, could have been used for this purpose. This mineral has the property of double refraction and reacts to polarized light. Even when the sun is hidden behind a thick veil, the crystal changes color or brightness, indicating the exact position of the sun. The navigator, holding the stone in an outstretched arm, rotated it, catching the changes in light in the crystal's facets. This allowed them to determine the direction of the sun with surprising accuracy, sufficient for plotting a course. Such technology was pure magic to the uninitiated and a secret weapon of Scandinavian sailors. It gave them confidence where others were lost and perished. In addition to the stone, the Vikings used their deep knowledge of the nature of the sea and the habits of animals. They read the direction of the wind, the color of the water, the nature of the waves, and the behavior of seabirds. In winter, the migration of whales and fish could indicate the proximity of land or warm currents. It was an intuitive, sensory orientation developed over centuries. On the ships themselves, portable braziers with coals were used during the cold season. They served not only to warm the crew, but also as signal fires in the fog. Maintaining a fire on the open deck in a storm was an art that required special skill. Losing the fire at sea threatened frostbite and death for the crew. Coastal landmarks also played a role. Signal fires were lit on the tops of cliffs. These beacons showed lost fishermen the way home and warned of danger. The signal light system could transmit information over long distances along the coast. It was a primitive but effective communication system. Winter voyages were usually short, coastal voyages along familiar shores. Only madmen or heroes of sagas dared to venture into the open ocean during the storm season. However, the ability to navigate in bad weather gave the Vikings a tactical advantage. They could attack or trade when no one was expecting them. Knowledge of the starry sky was essential for any helmsman, and they caught every break in the clouds. The North Star was the main landmark, a fixed point in the rotating celestial dome. The ability to find it in the gaps between the clouds saved many lives. Viking navigation was a blend of technology, observation, and mysticism. They trusted their instruments, but they trusted their instincts and experience even more. The sea was their home, even when it was grey, cold, and hostile. But even if you know the way, the cold will kill you before you get there. How did they protect their bodies from the deadly cold? In the next chapter, you'll learn about clothing technologies that work better than modern membranes. Clothing was a Viking's first line of defense in the war against the cold, and that defense was layered. The foundation of the winter wardrobe was wool, a material with unique properties that were valued at their weight in gold. The Vikings bred sheep with a special double-layered fleece. The long, coarse outer layer protected against rain, while the soft undercoat retained heat. Fabric made from this wool was dense and prickly, but incredibly warm and durable. The secret to the waterproofness of woolen clothing lay in lanolin, a natural fat that impregnates sheep's wool. The Vikings did not wash this fat out completely when processing the yarn, leaving a natural impregnation. Thanks to this, woolen tunics and cloaks repelled water and snow, remaining dry inside for a long time. Even when wet, wool continued to provide warmth, unlike linen or cotton, which instantly absorbed body heat. The principle of layering, which is used today by tourists and the military, was invented long before our time. The bottom layer was a linen shirt, comfortable against the skin, followed by a woolen tunic, and on top, a thick caftan or cloak. The air between the layers of clothing served as an additional insulator, retaining the heat emanating from the body. The number of layers was adjusted depending on the weather and the person's activity. Trousers were sewn wide so as not to restrict movement and were often tied under the knee. Knitted or fabric socks were worn on the feet, and woolen ribbons were wrapped around them. These wraps tightly secured the shin, protected against snow, and provided additional warmth to the feet. Leather shoes were impregnated with fat to prevent them from getting wet and stuffed with dry grass for insulation. The craftswomen took particular pride in needle knitting, knoll binding, an ancient technique of creating fabric with a single needle. Mittens and hats made in this way were very dense and did not unravel when the thread broke. In such mittens, it was possible to work with oars or an axe without fear of frostbite. Hats were often lined with fur to protect the ears and forehead from the wind. Fur was used not only for beauty, but also as the most powerful insulator. Cloaks made from sheep, wolf, or bear skins were indispensable on long journeys and while on guard duty. Fur was always worn with the pile facing inwards to retain heat, or outwards to protect against moisture, depending on the situation. Rich people could afford trimmings made of rare furs, such as sable or marten. The cloak was a versatile item. During the day, it protected from the wind, and at night, it served as a blanket. A rectangular piece of thick fabric was fastened with a brooch on the shoulder, leaving the right arm free for weapons. The color and quality of the cloak indicated the status of its owner from afar.
The fire burns brightly, but the cold bites deep. Stay vigilant, brother.
Clothes were carefully cared for, as it was understood that a hole in the knee could cost someone their health. Constant repairs, patching, and darning were part of evening gatherings around the hearth. Clothes were passed down, altered, and used until they were completely worn out. The Vikings knew that there was no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing, and took their equipment seriously. Their wool armor allowed them to survive and operate in conditions where modern synthetic fabrics would fail. To keep the body warm in the cold, clothing alone is not enough. You need an internal furnace that runs on calories. The Vikings' winter diet was radically different from their summer diet and was aimed at maximizing energy intake because the cold sapped their strength very quickly. The basis of their diet was proteins and fats, which could maintain heat and satisfy the body for a long time. Plant foods took a back seat as grain and vegetable supplies were limited and worth their weight in gold. Each meal was designed to provide maximum strength and endurance. Winter forced people to use food as a weapon against the cold. Those who did not eat properly quickly became weak and might not survive the long nights. Therefore, food was selected with particular care, taking into account its calorie content. Even children ate more fat in the cold months than in the summer to keep from freezing. Food became part of a survival strategy. The main salvation from hunger was dried fish, or stockfish, cod dried in the cold wind until it was as hard as a board. This product could be stored for years without losing its nutritional properties and without spoiling, even in damp conditions. Before consumption, the fish had to be beaten with a hammer for a long time to soften the fibers and make it edible. It was pure protein, a concentrated source of energy that could be taken on any trip without fear of spoilage. For northerners, such a supply was more valuable than gold. Stockfish allowed them to survive the most difficult weeks when hunting was scarce. They took it with them to sea, on trips, and to winter work far from home. The fish was light, nutritious, and almost weightless in a bag. Its dryness made it a real energy source. Therefore, every family tried to stock up on large quantities of dried fish. Meat was prepared in the fall, during the mass slaughter of livestock that could not be fed during the winter. It was salted, smoked in the smoke of the hearth, or pickled in whey for long-term storage to preserve as much food as possible. Smoked hams and sausages hung from the ceiling of the longhouse, soaking up smoke and aromas, which made them resistant to spoilage. Salt was expensive, so smoking and drying were more affordable methods of preservation, and almost everyone used them. Winter required a full supply of meat so that the family could live comfortably until spring. These preparations became the basis for most winter dishes. Salted and smoked meat was used to make soups that warmed better than any drink. The meat slowly softened in hot water, returning some of its juices. People knew how to store it properly so that it would not lose its taste. This gave them confidence that even in severe frost, there would be food on the table. Fermented shark or stingray meat was a special delicacy and source of vitamins. The specific ammonia smell scared off the unprepared, but for the Vikings it was a cure for scurvy and exhaustion because there were almost no fresh vegetables in winter. The fatty livers of marine animals were also eaten, supporting immunity and strength. Dairy products were preserved in the form of skyr, a thick fermented milk product similar to cottage cheese, which could be stored for months and did not require refrigeration. Such products provided the body with what could not be obtained from meat. Skyr was one of the most accessible sources of protein in winter. It was eaten with honey, dried berries, or on its own. Fermented products became a substitute for fresh food, which was impossible to obtain. People knew that without these dishes, they would quickly weaken. Therefore, a supply of skyr was as important as a supply of firewood. Grain was saved for porridge and flatbread baked on hot stones. The bread was coarse, mixed with bran, but filling and hot, which made it a valuable winter dish. Porridge was often seasoned with butter or lard to increase its calorie content and keep people warmer. Hot soup made from whatever was available was the main dish of a winter evening and brought everyone together around the hearth. In such dishes, it was not variety that was valued, but the ability to provide warmth. Even a small amount of grain was valued as much as other supplies. If the harvest was poor, porridge was prepared less often. But when there was enough grain, the food became more varied and satisfying. Warm bread lifted the spirits and strengthened the body. Therefore, it was prepared with particular care. The Vikings drank a lot of ale and mead, but not just for fun. Low-alcohol drinks were a source of calories and a way to keep warm, as well as a safe alternative to water, which could be too cold or contaminated in winter. The fermentation process killed bacteria, making the drink safe even for children in small quantities. Feasts with abundant food and drink were an important social ritual that strengthened ties between families. Such evenings gave people the strength to endure the long, cold spells. Mead helped to keep people warm and created a festive atmosphere even on the darkest days. It was brewed in advance and stored in large barrels. Drinking became part of the traditions and brought people together at the table. It did not replace food, but complemented it perfectly. This helped to maintain an atmosphere of friendship and unity. The ability to distribute food supplies so that they would last until spring was the art of the housewife. She had to make sure that no one went hungry, but also that no one overeated at the beginning of winter, so as not to use up everything ahead of time. A hungry spring was worse than the winter cold, when the old supplies ran out and the new ones had not yet arrived. Therefore, the housewife kept careful records of the food and monitored every barrel. The future of the family depended on her wisdom.
They said the trolls of the mountains would steal the sun, but Bjorn faced them with only his axe and his shield.
In winter, life was reduced to the size of a spot of light around the hearth, and within this circle, culture was born. When the physical world outside the walls fell silent, the world of imagination and memory awoke. The Longhouse became a stage, a school, and a library all at once. Oral tradition was the glue that held society together and passed knowledge down through the centuries.
What does the Traveler's Rune remind us of?
That the journey is long, and the gods watch over us.
By the warmth of this fire, we remember the Viking, their journeys long, their glory.
Skalds and storytellers were the stars of winter evenings, the keepers of history and myths. Their tales of gods, heroes, and great battles not only entertained, but also taught morals and laws. People listened to the sagas with bated breath, experiencing Thor's adventures or Loki's cunning as their own. The rhythm of the poems helped them memorize vast amounts of information without a single line being written down.
From the halls of the fallen, a whisper arose. A hero must journey where the shadows are born.
It was around the winter fire that the Viking's identity, his understanding of honor, destiny, and duty was formed. Young people learned about the exploits of their ancestors and dreamed of repeating or surpassing them. Stories of distant lands and rich spoils fueled their thirst for travel. The fire lit up the faces of the listeners, reflecting fear, excitement, and pride.
Odin himself, their axes singing songs of glory that day on the
Battles
shore.
were fierce, the glory eternal. They brought back treasures vast enough to secure their destiny among the gods.
Games were another way to combat boredom and train the mind. Board games such as Hanefataf developed strategic thinking and tactical skills. The excitement of the game helped them forget about the wind blowing outside the walls and the cold. Competitions in verbal sparring and riddles trained wit and eloquence.
What has roots as nobody sees is taller than trees. Up, up it goes, and yet never grows.
A mountain.
Discussing plans for the coming summer was an integral part of evening conversations. This is where ideas for new raids, trading expeditions, and alliances were born. Men argued about routes, equipment, and the division of future spoils. Winter was a time for strategy, when the foundations for future successes were laid. Religious rituals and sacrifices, blot, were performed to appease the gods and ask for protection. Yule, the midwinter festival, was the culmination of hope for the return of the sun. Shared meals and rituals united the community in the face of a common threat, eternal darkness. The belief that the gods saw their steadfastness gave them strength. In this close-knit world, they learned tolerance and the ability to quell conflicts before they flared up. Living side by side for months in a confined space was psychologically difficult. Social norms and etiquette helped maintain peace within the home. Expulsion from the warmth of the community was the most terrible punishment. Women played a key role in maintaining the atmosphere, often acting as guardians of traditions and memory. They remembered family trees, old grudges and alliances, steering conversations in the right direction. Their wisdom and words carried weight in family councils. The hearth was not just a place of warmth, it was an altar of human communication. It was here that the character of a people was forged, a people who would soon change the map of Europe. A word spoken by the fire was as strong as the steel of a sword.
Our strength lies not just in our axes, but in the history we share. The alliances forged in the past must guide our path forward.
Hail the sun! The long night is ended.
When the first rays of the sun began to linger on the horizon longer than usual, the Viking world was transformed. The end of the polar night was perceived as the victory of life over death, as a personal achievement of every survivor. People came out of their dark dwellings, squinting in the bright light, breathing in the frosty spring air. Preparations began for a new cycle of activity, for new horizons. The snow began to settle, and work moved from homes to the streets and coastline. Ships that had been propped up all winter were carefully inspected and prepared for launch. The smell of fresh resin and heated wood mingled with the smell of melting snow. It was the smell of freedom and adventure to come. Supplies saved and preserved thanks to technology and discipline now became provisions for voyages. Dried fish and meat were loaded into the holds of the dracars, providing for the crew during their voyages. Clothes sewn and mended on winter evenings were donned by the warriors. Weapons sharpened in the dim light were eager for action. Survival in winter was not an end in itself, but a way to gather strength for summer expansion. The harsh climate served as a natural filter, leaving only the strongest, smartest, and most adaptable. Those who managed to overcome the cold and hunger were not afraid of enemies of flesh and blood. The North tempered people, making them dangerous opponents for the pampered Southerners. The opening of navigation was the main event of the year, opening the way for trade and war. Young people who had survived their first adult winter became full members of the crews. The elders, who had survived another winter, shared their wisdom with the rest. Life burst out of its icy captivity in a torrent. The rituals of welcoming spring were filled with joy and gratitude to the forces of nature. Sacrifices for the fertility of the land and good luck at sea were performed with particular pomp. People celebrated the retreat of darkness and the return of light to the world. However, the lessons of winter were not forgotten with the arrival of warmth. Thrift, frugality, and foresight remained in the blood of the Scandinavians all year round. They knew that winter would inevitably return, and they had to be prepared for it at all times. This cycle of eternal return shaped a special perception of time. Survival technologies, lamps, houses, clothing, were not thrown away, but tidied up and stored away until the next season. They were silent heroes waiting for their moment to save people again. Respect for things and tools was part of the culture. The Vikings went out into the world not as barbarians, but as bearers of a unique experience of adaptation. Their ability to survive where others gave up was their main advantage, and it all started with a small wick in moss burning in a stone bowl. The sun rose higher and higher, illuminating the sails disappearing over the horizon. History continued, written by people who were not afraid of the dark. We have seen that the Viking Age is not only a history of fierce battles and long voyages, but also a chronicle of an incredible struggle for survival in the extreme north. Every detail of their daily life, from oil lamps to insulated houses, was the result of centuries of experience and engineering ingenuity. They managed to turn a hostile environment into their teacher, tempering their character and will. Without these technologies of light and heat, the expansion of the Vikings would have been simply impossible. The cold would have defeated them before they could build their first ship. Which Viking survival technology impressed you the most with its simplicity and effectiveness? Was it the eternal fat lamp or the multi-layered woolen clothing? Share your opinion in the comments and write about what other aspects of the ancient Scandinavians' lives you would like to learn about in future episodes. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into the past.